Well, Chris.
Hi.
Good to finally get the chance to sit down with you. Why don't you tell me a little bit about where you first came to the gorge? When was that, and how did you end up here?
Okay. Well, it started with me as a high school student in Asheville. It was Lee Edwards High School back then. It's Asheville High now. And I received a scholarship to attend Outward Bound in October of 1967. The school was new then. It was still largely under construction. It was largely a tent city then. They had the Phillips building. But it was a jewelry chain, Lee's Jewel Box, that gave scholarships to young men. It was not co-ed back then.
Right.
And I was given permission to leave high school for a month in October and come to the Outward Bound School.
That's great.
Yes, and it was a good opportunity. I was there with young men from all over North Carolina. There was a police officer. There were a lot of juvenile offenders back then. The court system was putting juvenile offenders into the Outward Bound School. So it was a real demographic mix, but it was not co-ed. And my diary of those events, we were each given a little notebook upon arrival. We were given a pair of boots in Morganton. We all assembled at a recreation center in Morganton that day, and were given boots, and we got a notebook, and I kept a diary of my 26 days at Outward Bound. I called it How I Skipped School for 26 days, which is not a really, it was not much of an escape. So the truck took us there to the school from Morganton, and thus began the adventure. We had a clothing list to buy, rough, twill and duck clothing, heavy socks and so on, shirts and jackets and all of that. And we were put into crews. I was put into the Anakiwa crew. There was a Kephart crew named after the famous Southern author Horace Kephart, who wrote Our Southern Highlanders.
Oh, yeah.
And there were a couple of other crews. And we started out with 15 in Anakiwa, who was led by Mr. John Lawrence. And his assistant was Dick Erickson, who had been a former Forest Service smoke jumper for forest fires. Lawrence himself was a former British Marine with an admirable resume. He played the violin, he taught philosophy, he had a snazzy looking sports car, he had climbed on Mount Everest, he'd climbed all over South America. He was the perfect, the ideal instructor and guide to a wilderness experience. The curriculum back then was a bit of first aid, a bit of wilderness plants that you could live on, but mostly it was geared around rock climbing. And we learned that the other schools specialized in things like seamanship, snow climbing in Colorado, Great Lakes boating and canoeing and so on. But the North Carolina Outward Bound School, situated as it was in the gorge with all these cliffs, was primarily centered around rock climbing instruction, which was given to us by a Swedish man named Newt. And we began practicing on very small boulders behind the school before we actually went up on the rock itself.
Yeah.
And we learned things such as, first of all, never to step on the rock, on the rope, and grind it into the rock, for which you had to do 10 push-ups.
It's a quick learning tool.
Right, and we used no metal equipment then. Everything had been fixed into place. There were the expansion bolts and the rings, and we just took along carabiners, slings, and coils of 150-foot, half-inch thick Plymouth gold line rope, that distinctive gold color, which was shortly to be absolutely made obsolete by the kern mantle, woven type that is still in effect today. Well, we used gold line back then. And we would go out and practice on short pitches on Table Rock. We would go to the chimneys for our rock climbing. But meanwhile, there was intensive hiking, map reading, and compass instruction and practical work going on. I believe there were 3 separate camping trips. One of ours, as a matter of fact, involved a truck drive in a freak snowstorm and bitter frost, a short truck drive up to the Grandfather Mountain And we were...
So it wasn't exclusively Linville Gorge?
No. That's a good point, Mike. They did truck us out to Grandfather Mountain, where I remember us stumbling around trying to gather firewood, and John Lawrence took us inside a large cave, large enough to, I think, to even have a fire in. We bedded down on piles of leaves that we found there, and since then I've gone back looking for that cave. I'm pretty sure it's the Black Rock Cliffs Cave. I'm pretty sure that it has been intensively camouflaged and barred off because of the endangered Virginia long-eared bats that are in there. Lawrence pointed out the little bats clinging to the walls as we went in and warned us not to disturb them because it would throw off their sleep cycle. But it was a very wet and miserable time, and looking back, and I can remember we spent another night on Grandfather Mountain, camped under sheets of plastic on top of Callaway Peak, and we woke up in this golden...
On top of Callaway Peak?
Mm-hmm. We woke up in this golden, brilliant rime ice. The rime ice was all over the trees, and there were sheets of it. All of the food was frozen, the boots were frozen, of course, and this thin plastic... It had ping pong balls and like a shower curtain clip around the round ball, and then a line to tie off with. It was just, we had to break it like a mirror for the ice. And then back to Outward Bound, and there was another very, very long expedition, they called them. That was a hike with campouts, an expedition that got us all the way around the gorge, down to the bottom, up to the pinnacle, and then swing on around, paralleling the Kistler, crossing the river far upstream, emerging north of Hawksbill, and then back to the school. That was, I think, our last major hike. Then we had the solo, and at that time, the big secret was that they gave everyone a live chicken. And they deposited us way up Forest Road 210, sort of nearing the direction of the Ginger Cake Acres community, out that way. One by one, Lawrence and Erickson led the Anakiwa crew members off into the wilderness and plonked us down in rhododendron clearings, drew an imaginary perimeter and said, "Do not leave that perimeter, and fend for yourself as best as you can. Good luck, we'll see you in 4 days. Here is your chicken." They handed me a chicken. I named mine after the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth with the goose Gertrude that accompanies, that was my Gertrude. I tied her leg with a string to a tree, and she got away in the night. And I could hear her clucking and circling me, for the next 2 days. And the instructors, I remember, said, that's cruelty to animals. A bear is going to get her, or she's going to starve to death. Well, I was not much of a poultry man in those days, so the bird eventually vanished. One of the other crew members cooked his chicken. The other two turned theirs back in. They could not bring themselves to do the deed. One of the guys found some salamanders. We were warned not to eat the rhododendrons; they're poison. Yeah. And I remember stumbling, limping back to the Outward Bound. They were not going to drive you back. After the 4 days, it was, hoof it back, we'll see you at the chow hall. And I was unable to keep the food down. After 4 days, it all came back up. And the solo was one of the climactic events in the Outward Bound experience. That was the time of reflection, and you were supposed to be putting together all the elements of your experience that you'd had up until that point. The other main thing that happened after the solo was the marathon run, which we saw in the movie just now. It was basically, I think, a 7-mile run to the top of Table Rock, over to Spence Ridge Trail, and then back to the Outward Bound School. And then it was over, and I was back in high school. I went into the Army in August of 1968. After graduating from high school, and since I had volunteered, I was given an opportunity to try out for any schooling I wanted, and my choices at that time were the Army Photography School in Fort Monmouth or the Green Berets down in Fort Bragg near Fayetteville, North Carolina. I chose the latter, which meant that I got all the advanced preliminary training for combat infantrymen in Vietnam, the Advanced Infantry School, and then by rights, they had to give me a chance to try out for airborne training, so I went down to Fort Benning and I did the 1-month parachute school, and then arrived as a fledgling Green Beret aspirant at Fort Bragg. And I chose the MOS or career of assistant radio operator. The Green Berets at that time were divided into a number of specialties: intelligence, weapons, medics, communication, and engineering. And engineering were basically explosives. So I chose to be the communications, which was at that time largely based on the Morse code and encrypting Morse code messages and transmitting them through a large hand crank generator and a key. The final graduation exercise for the Army Green Beret Communication School was a 2-week sojourn in the Linville Gorge. So here I was back again, lugging this infernal generator. The generator weighed 21 pounds. They called it the OD Monster. It had a little aluminum stool that you would set up. There were 2 compact black radios. One was a transmitter, one was a receiver. The transmitter needed the OD Monster to generate its power for transmission. The receiver needed a large, heavy, flat, dry cell battery to receive on. And of course, in your off hours, you could turn the receiver on and pick up music from South Africa, from Cuba, from wherever, using that dry cell battery. And we were supplied by a B team. The A teams were the ones out in the field. The C team were the ones back at Fort Bragg receiving our coded messages, by which we were graded and passed or failed by the amount of messages we got through. This was nonstop, 24/7, sending the messages back. If you were sleepy and it was rainy and you were hungry, you could perhaps afford to say, I waved my message, everyone go back to sleep. Otherwise, every 3 hours, someone had to be up turning the generator, stringing the antenna wire, and getting that message down to Fort Bragg.
Where were you in the gorge?
All over the gorge. They kept us constantly moving. We were never allowed to get too comfortable in one spot. Except for my little group, the same thing happened as at Outward Bound. We were down to such a bare minimum that it was almost questionable whether we should not be joined in with another larger group. But they kept us, again, as a 4-man team of Green Berets, and they let us stay at one spot out on the Kistler, I remember, for several days, which was unusual. The others were constantly kept on the move. The sergeants would pull up in their 3/4-ton truck and just leisurely say, I want you all over there on the top of that peak by 9 o'clock in the morning, get moving. And you had the choice to send your message or start moving at that point. The Green Beret instructors were interested to learn. I'd been at Outward Bound, and they kind of wondered what Outward Bound was all about. I could tell that there'd never been much informal contact between the 2 groups. Undoubtedly they ran across each other.
Well, Chris, how did you get back to the gorge?
Well, the gorge for me has always been a place of serenity, if you're careful, if you watch where you're going, serenity, peace, and renovation. And in times when I had left North Carolina and was living in New York City, living in Atlanta, living in Charleston, this was always a wonderful refuge to come back to. So I continued camping here throughout the 70s, 80s. And then in 1993, I was living in Atlanta with my girlfriend, Dorothy, and she began a search for a mountain cabin. And we began the search by looking in the Atlanta Journal and casting our net as far as North Georgia. And my remark on the properties we saw in North Georgia was, well, this is nice, but it's not the mountain. And we'd sort of given up, and I said, well, let me show you my #1 favorite place in the world. You're going to like this. It's called the Linville Gorge Wilderness Area. And we came up here, and we climbed Table Rock. She was as avid as I was about the gorge. We went, all up and down the parkway, and we were going back to Atlanta. We came through Linville Falls, just before Louise's, going south on 221. We looked over to the right and saw, well, there were 2 for sale signs. One was a little white arrow, a hand-whittled white arrow, which was this cabin, and the other one was for a property behind us. And we pulled in, and there was this little cabin for $50,000. And I knew, just by the way it smelled, for instance, after all those moldy lakeside properties, this had that nice, sweet, dry pine odor, etc., etc. It was nearly an acre of land, but the best thing, it was within walking distance of the gorge. So we made an offer and got the cabin, and in 1997 moved up here permanently. and began an intensive reacquaintance with the gorge. However, at that time it was based more or less on the published trails in the U.S. Forest Service map. I would not stray very far from Pine Gap or Bynum Bluff, and would do those trails over and over and over and just keep my neck out of the undergrowth. Well, I went to library school. This is a crucial turning point. I went to library school in the year 2000. In the reference class, they asked each student to find some area of interest of theirs, of passion and interest, and compile a bibliography of all the works that are out there on the internet, in libraries, in special collections, archives, etc. Just compile a master source list of everything on that topic. Well, there were some very interesting ones. There were prison rodeos, there were mustangs, the wild mustangs, there was the pottery at Jugtown, there was a girl who did the Appalachian Trail. I think the instructor was expecting me to do something very literary, but no, there was the Linville Gorge. And with a fine-tooth comb, I went over everything that I could find at that time. I remember Appalachian State had some materials, for instance, on the paving of the Kistler. That has been an issue that has come up year after year after year. So Interlibrary alone brought me a lot of materials. The old Our State magazine, I had some wonderful old articles going way back into the 40s and 50s in which outings to the gorge are almost described as like African safaris, where we may not come back. Well, there's that aura of high danger and excitement, and old black and white photos in this magazine. It was a joy to go back and look at that stuff and see how the attitudes have changed. It was good, and then all the old books that I could find. I made this master list for my project. And out of this, my first book came. I simply reproduced those texts, the full text of the documents, and produced the book River of Cliffs in 2005.
I just happen to have my copy.
This is the one. This has my Outward Bound diary in it. It has my summary of what I could remember of the Green Berets in it, and then also some a lot of the influential 19th century travel writers. The railroads were just coming in there, through here, and they published a wonderful, extravagantly flowery written descriptions of Roan Mountain, of staying at the Cloudland Hotel, or visiting the falls at Linville, or visiting Grandfather. It was all part of the early development of travel and tourism in western North Carolina. Ziegler and Grosscup were a couple of northern writers who wrote a book called The Heart of the Alleghenies, of western North Carolina. That is in here. Also significantly, the report to Governor Tryon of the massacre of the William Linville party in the gorge. I put that in here. And then finally, all the way through to current, 1960s accounts of things happening in the gorge, a history of Linville Falls, and then finally an account, a legendary account of a man named Franklin who took a bet that he could make it up the Linville Gorge in one day. He drank a pint of White Lightning, he tied off the cuffs of his trouser pants with string, stuffed his pants full of leaves, and shot off up the gorge from down at the bottom, where a community called Fontaflora used to be. That was probably still there when he did this. But down near Lake James, he headed north, and before he'd gone 2 miles, a man who'd followed him said he had his trousers bristling with copperheads and rattlesnakes. They made strikes at him, and he was carrying them northward through the gorge. And Alan Hyde got a hold of this, and it sort of provided the colorful inspiration for his Franklin Challenge. Yeah. And so that's how I got here. I make it out to the gorge at least 3 or 4 times a week. I have an organization here.
Yeah, tell us about that. That's Friends of the Gorge?
Friends of Linville Gorge. Friends of Linville Gorge is, there's no real organization, there's no website, there's no dues, fees. Everyone in this earth is a membership, is a member unless they do something to hurt the gorge. So it's very casual and loose-ended, largely because I don't have a website, and what I do is publish articles in the paper or send out invitations personally. I would love it if more people heard about this. What we officially do is maintain the Devil's Hole Trail for the U.S. Forest Service in Nebo Adopt-A-Trail program.
Sure.
The Friends also conducts twice annual mushroom forays. We have a gentle, easy one for the kids and the young folks that we conduct at the Linville Falls picnic area, which is across from the spur road going out to the Falls Visitor Center.
Right.
And we wind along through that picnic ground looking for mushrooms. My friend Pete Wheelahan, who is a commercial grower in Asheville, leads the foray. We identify them, we get them all on a picnic table and classify them by the species, and then we stir fry the edible ones on crackers. Where we have not found anything, he always has a backup supply of the exotic mushrooms he's grown, so he brings those up and I open up the Coleman stove and we stir fry them. We do the same thing again later in the year going down the Spence Ridge Trail. That is for the hardier people.
Well, now, if somebody wanted to be part of these mushroom forays, how would they find out about it?
Well, I post an article in the Avery Journal.
Gotcha.
However, if someone is interested in emailing me and wants to be kept up to date, they can contact me at gorgestalker@gmail.com.
Okay, we'll put that on the video.
And I will I guess, start a list on a clipboard and send out a mass emailing to everyone who's contacted me. Similarly, anyone who wants to break sweat working on the Devil's Hole Trail can contact me and is welcome to join those little outings 4 times annually. The Forest Service requires 3. I go ahead and make a winter walkthrough as well, because that's when so much of the limbs drop. I am really specializing in the history of the gorge, the written documents, and then I like to more or less tidy up and take care of, look after the northwestern quadrant of the gorge, basically running from Pine Gap all the way around to the northern contour trail.
Right.
And I'm very pleased with that. I'm retired now. I work part-time for the Toe River Arts Council as a publicist. And that doesn't take very much of my time. So the rest of my days, I am out there in the gorge, considering myself very, very thankful, appreciating it. It was almost a teenager's dream come true to have a house here and be able to walk out the front door and walk to the top of Table Rock and back.
That's fantastic. Well, Chris, what led to the creation of your second book, Linville Gorge Wilderness Area, Images of America?
Well, I'd seen the popular Arcadia series. There's some 4,000 of these books out now, and they go from topics such as Alcatraz Island to actual neighborhoods. The Embarcadero in San Francisco, they get that detailed. There are a number of very fine ones on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Asheville, of course, is going to have several. Black Mountain has got one. I just thought it would be a good idea to do the Linville Gorge Wilderness Area. Since I'd seen some striking old-time photographs of the gorge and thought people would love to see these collected in a book. If you go to Spears Restaurant for the barbecue over there in downtown Linville Falls, you'll see giant blow-ups of photographs made by a man named F.W. Bicknell.
Yeah.
And Bicknell lived in a little white cottage overlooking the falls, managing property that was owned by the Hausfelds. And he lived there. I think he put in a lot of the trails around there, including the Marion Wright. I think Marion Wright goes back as far as Bicknell's days because it's the shortest.
It's interesting to know. I've always wondered how it came to be.
It's been there a long time.
Sure.
Having seen those pictures in Spears, I started casting my net again, as I did with the earlier book about the writings on the gorge. I found that the largest photograph holders in this state, of course, are it's the I think Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill, and then the Department of the State Archives in Raleigh. So I made an expedition down there, picking pictures and asking them for them to be scanned and arranging for the permissions to have them reprinted.
Wow.
So it was simply a matter of putting all these things together. Mike Fischesser, I owe a great debt to Mike Fischesser for his early Outward Bound and Linville Gorge photographs. Alan Hyde, Brad Sanzenbacher, they all pitched in. Cato Holler. I couldn't have done the book without them.
Well, it's a great book. I know I've picked it up occasionally just to look through the pictures. These books are still both available, aren't they?
I'm afraid River of Cliffs has gone out of print. You can find used copies on Amazon or the other vendors online. The publisher retired. It was Parkway Publisher in Boone, and I bought the remainder of his stock. I would love to have that book back in print. with a second edition with additional sources that I found.
Well, I tell you, I know a lot of Gorge Rats would love to see a second edition, because this is one of the first books I've ever purchased on the Gorge, and I love it.
Well, thank you, Mike. One of the things I found, for instance, is the biography, a very, very old, unpublished biography of Daniel Boone by a man called Lyman C. Draper. The book was edited by a historian, and it is in print now. He transcribed this man's scratchy handwriting and produced this history of Daniel Boone. There are 2 full pages on Daniel Boone's involvement in the gorge for the search of the bodies of the Linville hunting party.
No kidding.
Linville was related by marriage to Boone.
Yeah, I did hear that.
And Boone was up in the Adkins settlement. We don't know exactly where. There is a Park Service interpretive ranger named Jonathan Benning, I think, who is acutely involved in that whole story of Boone's involvement in the search.
That's fantastic.
And the actual location of the massacre varies from Short Off, down below Short Off, to below the falls, to someplace up near Altamont. But Draper does indicate that Boone himself came down here looking.
What's your theory on where the massacre was?
I cannot venture one, Michael, because the discrepancy in the accounts. Some say below the falls,
yeah.
Some say above the falls. There's even some disagreement as to who were involved among the hunting party. They were long hunters, out for
Sure.
out for 6 months or more to get enough skins to live comfortably on for a long time, and they ran across a war party of northern Indians. Benning thinks they might be Iroquois coming down to do battle with the Cherokee.
That's possible. Yeah.
They were not local Indians, but still there was the whites were in violation of a treaty banning all settlement in the Blue Ridge itself. And of course, there was no stopping that.
No.
The massacre didn't stop anyone from coming up here and getting land. Well, in wrapping up, Michael, let me just tell you about some other things that I was involved with that I'd like to go on the record.
Sure.
I was sitting in Louise's with a date, and Bob Underwood happened to be sitting nearby and overheard me. The meeting with Bob Underwood outside Louise's was crucial in my knowledge of the gorge. Bob got me thinking beyond the perimeters of the Forest Service map. It was Bob and Alan who took me out and showed me where the Marion Wright Trail runs. Mm-hmm. So that was a very crucial meeting in my experience, and through that I was made aware of the Rock Jock, a number of unofficial trails, of the possibility one day of there being a grand loop around the gorge, which has finally been attested to by Mr. Faulkner and his family outing, the 50-mile walk, which was written up in the papers. The same year I met Bob, we were poking around in the woods up above the Falls Visitor Center, and I found human remains. I found the skull of a camper. This was in October, I think, of 2005. Philip A. Duane Jr., 68 years old, from Ocala, Florida, had been missing for 2 years. At the time of his disappearance, he'd left a message in his car at the campground at the falls. I've gone camping, supposedly. 2 years, there'd been a massive hunt with dogs and helicopters, I think, at that time. And then that all subsided. 2 years later, I happened to notice a white patch in the woods that looked either like a grocery bag or a large mushroom, and it was the man's skull. The lower jawbone was missing. And I called Bob to look at it, and he nearby had found a campsite, a crude campsite with a little fire pit and a sleeping bag full of bones. Now Bob assumed somehow that those bones were cow bones and that it was part of bait to attract a hunter. We called the Park Service. They came, and the rangers, Ben Hansel, who was a fan of my book, that's the first thing he said when it got out. "Oh, I've read your book." Those generators must have been heavy. We showed them the scene, and they taped it off. They closed for the weekend. They closed the whole falls area, and basically just they sent the skull and the bones to the state lab, to the coroner in Chapel Hill, and it was decided that no cause of death really could be assigned to it.
Too long.
It was too long. There were actually leaf stains on the skull, and I didn't touch anything. I noticed that there were fillings in it, and I knew better than to disturb anything. But the case was closed with his identification. He was the only outstanding missing person case. Then later, quickly, I was there for the lowering of the footbridge. That was
Oh yeah, yeah.
that was put down on the Spence Ridge Trail to cross the gorge, where for year after years, I remember, there were makeshift logs thrown across the river, waiting for the next flood to sweep them down to Lake James.
And if you want to see any of those bridges, they're down toward Lake James.
Yeah, they're all stacked up neatly on the side of the bank. Switchbacks, a Cartersville, Georgia trail building company. My brother's from Cartersville and actually knew the family. They won the contract. Mike Fishesser provided me with copies of the architectural drawings, and I made contact with the man who owns the company, and they told me when the bridge would be delivered from its staging area down in North Cove.
Right.
They told me the components of the bridge, the different timbers that were used. I think the main footpaths are Alabama pine or something. There's black walnut in it. They helicoptered it in on a summer morning at 9 o'clock, 3 trips with a helicopter to lower it. I photographed that happening from Wiseman's View rather than being down.
I've seen some of your pictures, yeah.
And
now that was they used a huge Sikorsky flying
yes,
crane.
yeah.
So
and,
that must have been something.
That was probably a large bit of the bill. The final bill was for the helicopter. I think the helicopter was trucked as far as Hickory, and then he went airborne and started moving the bridge in. The bridge is still there. Underwood was a little skeptical as to its staying power. We've not had a large...
It's below the hurricane flood level. So.
And since that, I have seen what happens when I was here, when Beryl came through, Ivan, Katrina, Francis. I go out and look at the falls of the wall of angry, muddy, brown water pouring over in one single flow. And I think of the little bridge. We haven't had a tropical storm of those dimensions.
Well, this year we've seen some pictures from some people that were down in there this past year, and the water was up to the bridge.
That's right. I saw that, Mike,
Yeah.
and I actually downloaded it. That's another wonder of the internet. I've seen that picture.
A little debris coming down in that flow. And
one of the hurricanes, my friend Pete and I went and looked at the damage done to the visitor center. It was trashed, and they rebuilt a new visitor center with a mural in there now, and the giant hemlock with the drawers that you pull out with the ages. The bookstore had to be totally rebuilt. The bridge, trunks were lying across the bridge and had smashed those sturdy aluminum railings, just pretzeled them, and eaten out big holes, eroded big holes down at the falls end of that bridge. There was a creek flowing through the parking lot where Duggar Creek had dammed up. Amazing. Man and his incursions into the wilderness can really seem puny at times.
Oh, absolutely.
Nature really puts on a spectacular display of destruction. Over there is the Breakaway Park. Breakaway because the side of the gorge is actively tumbling off, detaching and tumbling off, somewhat dangerous in places. It's called Breakaway Park, and it basically extends from the Park Service and Forest Service boundary north to where the Marion Wright Trail emerges back out on the cliff edge again. I've divided the Marion Wright into 3 sections basically. This first one from the Pine Gap parking lot goes to the line with the Park Service, the Park Service Forest Service border line. From there up to the cliff edge where the trail emerges back out of the woods again. That's the second stage, and then the third stage is from that emergence point up to the Park Service chimney view. Bob's friend Alan calls the gorge a slow motion rockside, meaning which that all around the rim of the canyon, rocks are slowly detaching themselves and tumbling down to the river. We are now here at Breakaway Park, which is a little side view spur off of the Marion Wright Trail. These are some of the rocks that give the place its warranted name. They're very dangerous. They teeter when you stand on them. All along the cliff edge here, we're high above the river. These rocks are loose, unstable, and on the verge of tumbling down to the river. So use caution here, folks. Here we are at the famous view, it's not famous yet, I hope it will be, of Hawksbill Mountain. According to the map, it is 3.1 miles south of this point. We're up above a bend on the river. Down here, the river turns sharply left, going north to the falls. This is your last, or your first major gooseneck bend below the falls. Look at that tall pine tree where my finger is pointing. The river has made a circular swoop around here, forming a circular valley just about, which we call this landmass here, this little hill, Old Snuffy Smith's Boot, because it looks like that on the map. That tall pine tree there marks where the river has almost doubled back on itself, going south to Hawksbill. Obviously, this is part of a mountain moonshine still. This is part of your copper piping discovered on the Rock Jock Trail in the wilderness, south of Hacker's Point, south of T-Shirt Rock, somewhere down in there, just lying in the underbrush. Here it is. It looks like an angry sheriff has dismantled the gorge and flung it piecemeal into the wilderness.
I guess they didn't know the price of copper was going to go.
Exactly. And here it is. It is an artifact. It's part of the history of the gorge. There was moonshining activity in the gorge.
There's proof.
There's a tale to tell here. And that's all we know about it. How flimsy and puny are the works of man? Well, this sign was washed downstream by one of the tropical storms that flooded the falls in the gorge area. It's a DOT highway sign I found crumpled up, smashed, twisted, and bent under some rocks down on the river and hauled it out as trash. It gives you some idea of the flood damage. There are parts of bridges and driveways and structures and other buildings that have been washed away by flooding on the Linville River down in the gorge. This plank behind it, I floated on my tummy from the falls down to Pine Gap, paddling on this hefty plank, which is obviously government wood, solid 2-inch thick oak with monster rusted nails in it. It made a wonderful surfboard. Thank you.
Oh, your hard hat.
Always wear a helmet. Those hemlock boughs are coming down thick and fast.
So, none such on your cabin.
There's no other place like it. It's none such. That was Henry VIII had a palace out in the English countryside. It burned down. It was called None Such. It's also the name of a folk music company.
Ah.
None Such.
All right.
This is Little Sister.
Well, little sister, it was a pleasure meeting you.
She's a gorge cat.
Well, Chris, thank you for your time, my friend.
Thank you, Mike. And I will be in touch with the Linville